Take a deep breath in and feel the hush of the sea breeze as it drifts through a sun-warmed window. Let your shoulders ease and your thoughts settle like petals falling into still water. You are here now in the quiet town of Bellmare, where the scent of salt and lilac lingers in the air like a memory waiting to be remembered. Our story begins at the edge of a cliffside garden, where old stone steps wind downward toward the harbor below. Bellmare rests between the hills and the sea, wrapped in flowering vines and slow-ticking clocks. It is a town that moves at its own pace, where the baker still ties ribbons around his loaves and children, leaves seashells on neighbors' doorsteps in place of letters. Tucked beside the crooked lanes is a flower shop with a green shuttered window and a door that chimes like a soft bell when opened. The painted sign above reads Maison Fleury, a name worn with time and sunshine. Inside, the air smells of wild rosemary and rose tea, and in the center of it all stands Elodie. She is young but carries a stillness beyond her years. Her fingers are always stained with pollen and ribbon dye. Her hair is usually tied back with a faded scarf that once belonged to her grandmother, a florist before her. The shop is both her haven and her intense, filled with whispers of blooms long forgotten and traditions gently sleeping. That morning, Elodie was replanting the window box. The season had turned, and the pansies had given way to trailing heliotrope. As she dug into the soft soil, something caught the edge of her trowel. A hollow sound like tapping glass or an old box tucked too far beneath a drawer. She paused, brushed the dirt away carefully, and uncovered the corner of a small wooden panel. Beneath it was a shallow recess in the wall, hidden under the display table where dried bouquets hung in little upside-down bundles. Inside the space lay a narrow, cloth-bound ledger with delicate gold etching and a pressed violet tucked beneath its ribbon. Elodie carried the book to the work table and opened it slowly, as though turning the pages of something sacred. The writing inside was faded but elegant, each line marked with the name of a bouquet, its ingredients, and a curious phrase written beside it in ink that smelled faintly of lavender oil. For remembrance with comfort, forget-me-nots, chamomile, one white rose, to quiet the echo of goodbye, bluebell, sage, sprig of ivy, to wake a sleeping heart, snowdrop, hyacinth, and a thread of gold. Elodie turned the pages, her breath catching slightly as she realized what this was. Not a sales ledger, a message ledger. A record of flower meanings passed between townsfolk like folded notes, woven into petals and stems. She remembered stories her grandmother used to tell when they sat in the garden. How flowers used to speak, how every arrangement had meaning. Not the ones printed in books, but meanings passed down, soft meanings that changed with the wind, shaped by memory, love, sorrow, and forgiveness. She had always thought them stories meant for bedtime and dreams, but here they were, written in ink and belief. As she read deeper, Elodie found entries without names. No recipient, no price. Just the blooms and the message. These unfinished arrangements sat like empty chairs at a gathering, unspoken, unread, undelivered. Something stirred in her chest. She closed the book gently and looked around the shop. Sunlight spilled through the green shutters, catching the dust in quiet swirls. The wind carried in the scent of the lavender hills from beyond the valley. Elodie stood and selected a handful of flowers from the buckets by the counter. A pale rose, sprigs of rosemary, and a curl of dusty miller. She didn't look at the book this time. She just arranged them by feel. Then, with careful hands, she wrapped the bouquet in cream paper and tied it with soft twine. She didn't write a name. She simply placed it in a small wooden basket and stepped outside. Bellmare was quiet that morning. Only the sea and the bells in the harbor tower moved with any certainty. Elodie walked the cobbled lane and paused before a blue door near the old painter's studio. She had seen the woman who lived there only once or twice, always with her head down, her eyes far away. Elodie set the bouquet on the doorstep and stepped back. The breeze caught the ribbon just so, lifting it like a hand waving farewell. She didn't wait to be seen. She walked back to her shop with the feeling that something gentle had just begun. The next morning, a soft knock sounded at the flower shop door just after sunrise. Elodie was in the back room preparing tea when she heard it, quiet and hesitant, like someone unsure whether to disturb the morning hush. She set her cup down and walked softly through the shop, the wooden floor creaking beneath her slippers. Outside stood the woman from the blue door. She held the bouquet Elodie had left, now untied, the paper slightly crinkled, and her eyes looked brighter than the day before. She didn't speak at first, just held out the flowers as if asking for a secret to be confirmed. "These reminded me," the woman said gently, "of something I'd forgotten I loved." Elodie smiled, not with words, but in the way one smiles when something has been understood without being explained. The woman nodded once, placed a tiny packet of sugar cubes on the table near the door, and left. No name was given, no payment asked. Elodie stood for a moment in the hush that followed, the kind of hush that feels full, not empty. Later that day, she returned to the hidden ledger and turned to the first blank page. In soft ink, she recorded the bouquet and the address, and in the column for the message she wrote, "To remember joy without asking why." From that day on, Elodie made a habit of rising just before the bells rang from the harbor tower. She would step into the garden behind the shop, collect whatever blooms caught her attention that morning, and then build an arrangement not for sale, but for someone she had seen only in passing or heard about in whispers. The second bouquet went to a young man who painted ships on the underside of pebbles and left them along the coast path. The third to a retired school teacher who still put out chalkboards in her garden as if waiting for a class to arrive. Each delivery brought something back to the village. Not excitement or noise, but noticing. People lingered at their doorsteps. They listened when the wind shifted. They began to ask how one another was doing, not as a courtesy, but as a question that wanted answering. One evening, as the shop bathed in golden light, Elodie's hand brushed the very back of the ledger. A page slightly thicker than the rest was tucked into a fold. It was hand-bound and stitched with violet thread. No ink, just a small press card. For the garden that forgets no one. Below the card, in the fold of the cover, was an old map faded and soft as cloth. It showed a path that trailed beyond Bellmare's last visible street, where wild thyme grew in tangles and bees moved like warm-hearted thoughts. Elodie traced the line with her finger. It curled up past the cliffs, through a grove marked only by a symbol of a closed flower, and ended at a place labeled simply as the Silent Bloom. The name made her breath still for a moment. The garden her grandmother had once spoken of, a place no one had visited in decades, maybe longer. A place not on any map sold or drawn in town. She thought it was only a bedtime story, told in warm beds with rain on the windows, but this map was real. The next morning, after arranging the daily deliveries and sweeping petals from the counter, Elodie packed a small bag with ribbon, a pair of pruning shears, a notebook, and the ledger. She slipped the map into her pocket, wrapped herself in her long blue shawl, and stepped out as the sea fog was just beginning to lift. The path was quiet and lined with lavender that had gone slightly wild. Sparrows darted above her, calling softly to each other, and in the distance, waves hummed against the shore like a lullaby the earth never stopped singing. Each step felt like a turning page, a quiet invitation to walk not just into the hills, but into memory. Elodie paused as the grove of trees came into view. They stood like sentinels around a clearing that shimmered faintly with dew. The air there felt older, like it had waited too long to be breathed again. In the center of the clearing was a low stone wall. Inside, tangled ivy and rose hips grew freely among statues of cracked marble and ironwork trellises twisted into soft arcs. It was not just a garden, it was a forgotten sanctuary. And it was waiting. Elodie stepped into the forgotten garden like one might enter a dream still unfolding. The stone path beneath her feet was cracked and moss-covered, but each step released the faintest trace of lavender, rosemary, and something older still, a scent she couldn't name but knew in her bones. It felt as if the air itself had held its breath, waiting for someone to return. The wrought iron gate creaked gently as she passed through, not with resistance, but with age, like the slow turning of a page long closed. Within the garden, vines hung like soft drapery, curling around benches and archways that once might have held flowering jasmine. Sunlight filtered through the overgrowth, dappled and golden, casting soft patterns across the stonework. She stood for a while in stillness, her fingers resting gently on a flowering branch of wild verbena. Her eyes traced the layout of the space, noticing where the flower beds had once been carefully arranged, where hedges had been trimmed into spirals, and where an old sundial now leaned slightly beneath a blanket of ivy. In the center of the garden stood a low pedestal made of pale stone. Upon it, covered in a layer of lichen and thyme, rested a shallow brass bowl, green with patina. Beneath the bowl, carved into the pedestal, were the same words she'd found in the ledger, "For the garden that forgets no one." She crouched beside it, brushing away leaves and time-softed dust with the edge of her sleeve. Beneath the bowl, within a small hollow space, lay a bundle of tightly bound parchment tied with faded ribbon. Her fingers trembled slightly as she lifted it out and unfolded the topmost page. The handwriting was unfamiliar, older, written in careful script. It appeared to be a journal of some kind, filled with flower arrangements, names, and what looked like intentions or blessings. But unlike the ledger in the shop, this one contained no recipients, just offerings. Elodie turned the page. One entry read, "For a child whose name was never spoken aloud, primrose, snowdrop, and a drop of rainwater from the last frost." Another, "For a traveler who left and never returned, wisteria, forget-me-not, one lock of silver thread." And another still, "For a song never sung, bellflower, reed grass, and the feather of a sleeping bird." Each entry felt like a whispered prayer, not gifts sent to someone, but tributes left behind. Each bouquet a gentle nod to those whose stories had slipped between the cracks of time. She let out a soft breath and sat on a low stone bench, her bag resting beside her. The trees around her rustled faintly, and the scent of the garden deepened with the shifting breeze. The space felt neither lonely nor abandoned, but expectant. She reached into her satchel and pulled out the flowers she had brought from the shop that morning, a single ivory hellebore. It had bloomed earlier than usual, its petals creamy with green veins, delicate yet resolute. Without thinking, Elodie crossed to the brass bowl and laid the hellebore within it. A peace settled in her chest, as though the garden had taken a breath of its own. She returned to the bench, opened her notebook, and began to write. Her words came slowly at first, uncertain, but then steadied as her thoughts aligned with the hush of the space around her. She recorded the arrangement, the garden scent, the feeling that clung to the air like velvet. She titled the page, "For Those Who Bloom in Silence." As the sun began to drift lower behind the trees, Elodie carefully replaced the brass bowl, the journal, and the ribbon notes. She stood and looked around the garden once more, taking in the way the light kissed the overgrowth, the way petals stirred on their stems as if responding to her presence. Then she whispered softly, "Thank you." The trees answered with a hush, not of goodbye, but of recognition. She left the garden slowly, following the same mossy path, heart full of something tender and new. She would return soon. There was more here to understand, more to offer. By the time she reached the shop, twilight had turned the sky into a watercolor of plum and gold. She lit the lantern above the door and stepped inside. The shop felt warmer now, as if it too had exhaled. She sat at her work table, opened the original ledger, and copied the new entry from her notebook beneath today's date. "For those who bloom in silence, hellebore, brass bowl, a page remembered." And then, beneath it, she wrote something more, The garden still listens. The days that followed unfolded like petals on a warm windowsill. Bellmare's streets remained quiet as they always were, but something delicate stirred beneath the surface. A neighbor would pause just a second longer to listen to the wind. A child would return to a place they had once forgotten how to visit, a stone bridge, a hollow tree, a tucked-away bench beneath ivy. Elodie continued her rhythm. Each morning, before the fog lifted from the sea, she gathered fresh blooms from her backyard and from the pots she tended with quiet care. She chose them not for their beauty alone, but for the way they felt in her hands, the scent they carried, and the memories they seemed to hold. The bouquet for the town seamstress included lilac, sprigs of thyme, and one pale tulip. The next morning, the seamstress brought a small bundle of lavender-dyed thread and left it by Elodie's doorstep without a word. Another bouquet went to the boy who played the violin at the fountain. She had seen him many times, playing soft tunes that danced through the market square. He never asked for coin, just played as if the town itself needed his music more than he did. She left him a cluster of freesia and snowdrops tied with sky blue ribbon. Later that week, she found a small page of sheet music tucked between the flowers in her window box. It had no title, only the notes. She played them softly on the old music box in the corner. The melody hummed through the room like something half-remembered, and it stayed in her ears all afternoon. Elodie recorded each of these moments in her journal and in the ledger side by side like twin branches of the same growing tree. Still, her thoughts drifted often to the hidden garden beyond the grove. Each visit deepened her connection to it. She brought new offerings, small, simple arrangements placed gently in the brass bowl or left at the base of the sundial. Some days she read the old journal she had found, now wrapped carefully in cloth. Other days she sat in silence listening, and there was always something to listen to. The rustling of wind through forgotten archways, the hush of petals brushing one another. Once, even the distant ring of a bell, though she could not say where it came from. On the fifth visit, something had changed. Near the pedestal, she noticed a small box tucked between two stones. It hadn't been there before. Its wood was darkened with age, the corners smooth from time. A note was placed on top, written in a delicate, looping hand. It read, "If the garden remembers, so must we." Inside the box were slips of paper, each folded into a simple triangle. She opened one carefully. For a daughter whose lullaby was never sung, anemone, starflower, one tear before sleep. Another, for a promise made beneath the fig tree, laurel leaf, basil, candle ash. The messages were not signed, yet each held a feeling too specific to be invented. They were truths, left behind not to be claimed, but to be honored. Elodie sat beside the garden wall and read each one aloud in a soft, reverent voice. As she read, she laid a petal on the grass beside her, one for each memory, one for each unspoken farewell. When she reached the final slip, she did not open it. She simply placed it back into the box, tied the ribbon once more, and returned it to the place she had found it. Some things, she thought, are meant to stay folded. That evening, she returned to the shop and arranged a bouquet for herself, a rare thing. It held iris for clarity, marigold for warmth, and sage for the moment she did not yet understand. She placed the bouquet in a vase by her bed, and as she lay beneath her woven quilt, the melody from the fountain boy's music still humming faintly in the walls, she felt something settle within her. Not an answer, not yet, but a quiet knowing that the garden would continue to speak, and she would continue to listen. The sun had barely risen when Elodie unlocked the shop door and stepped into the morning hush. The town still slept, roofs glistening with dew, and the sky slowly shifted from indigo to soft shell pink. A gull cried faintly over the harbor, its call trailing like a ribbon on the breeze. She moved through the flower shop with gentle care, watering each pot, turning each stem toward the light. Her fingers brushed petals like old friends, adjusting the curve of a leaf here, tucking a ribbon there. But today, she kept glancing toward the ledger. It sat closed on the work table, resting atop a piece of hand-woven linen. She hadn't written it since her last garden visit, not because she had nothing to say, but because what was beginning to form inside her needed more than words. She opened it now and turned to a blank page. She dipped her pen, hesitated, then wrote, "For a window that waits with amber light." She wasn't sure why the words came, only that they did. That same morning, she had noticed it again, the tall window near the edge of the town square, always glowing faintly no matter the time of day. Amber light spilled from it like syrup, warm and golden, curtains never drawn fully shut, a presence behind the glass, but never a silhouette. Some said an old clockmaker lived there, though no one had seen him in years. Elodie packed a small bouquet, 3 golden ranunculus blooms, pale green ferns, and a single stem of honesty with silver-white seed pods that shimmered in the light. She tied it with wax thread and placed it in a small linen pouch. Then, slipping on her shawl, she walked slowly through the town. Bellmare was beginning to wake. Shutters creaked open. The baker's chimney puffed sweet smoke, and the cobblestones rang faintly beneath careful feet. Children skipped rope in the alleyways, their laughter soft and round. At the foot of the amber-lit window, she found a wooden step painted in layers of flaking blue. She placed the pouch carefully on the ledge, beneath the lace curtain, and whispered quietly, "For remembering what still ticks, even when we cannot hear it." She walked away without looking back. Later that day, as she swept the shop and dusted the shelves, a light knock brushed against the doorframe. No one stood in the doorway. But on the ground, laid precisely and with intention, was a small parcel wrapped in time-worn paper and bound with twine. No card, no message. Elodie brought it inside and opened it slowly. Inside was an old watch face, its glass cracked slightly at the edge, and within it rested a pressed flower, a yellow pansy, preserved so carefully its petals still held the whisper of velvet. She turned the watch face over. Etched along the rim, faint and nearly worn smooth, were the words, "So you always know the hour of the heart." She pressed her fingers to the glass, cradling the piece like a delicate truth. That night, she placed the watch in a small wooden shadow box and hung it above the counter. The amber window remained, still glowing, still silent, but something unseen had passed between them, a moment, a message, and that was enough. As twilight deepened, Elodie sat by the open window of her room, a cup of lemon verbena tea warming her hands. She listened to the breeze stirring the vines, to the soft clink of wind chimes in a neighboring garden. Bells from the harbor rang in the distance, long and low. She thought of the garden again. Not the one behind her shop, the one beyond the grove, where petals slept on marble and stories waited in folded paper. It was calling her back. She could feel it in the tilt of the air, the way certain flowers had bloomed early in her care, the way her dreams had begun to fill with faint music and turning clock hands. She opened the ledger once more. Beneath the earlier entry she wrote, "Return with Jasmine. Leave nothing behind." And then she closed the book, not with finality, but with readiness. In Bellmare, the stars began to blink to life. And in the hidden garden beyond the hills, something began to bloom. The next morning, the clouds hung low over Bellmare, soft and silver like wool spun from mist. Elodie rose early, wrapping her shawl tightly around her shoulders. The quiet had deepened overnight. Even the gulls seemed to glide more gently over the rooftops. She stepped into her back garden, where her plants shimmered with dew. The jasmine had bloomed, unexpected, fragrant, curling white petals kissed with green. She clipped 3 blossoms, tied them with twine, and tucked them into the same pouch she used for her quiet offerings. Inside her satchel, she placed her notebook, ribbon, a small cloth, and a single polished stone from the shop's windowsill. It had once belonged to her grandmother, smooth and warm as memory. Then, without speaking, she left through the alley behind her shop and took the long path up toward the grove. The walk felt different now, not heavier or lighter, just more known, as though her feet remembered the way before she could think. The wind moved through the trees with a hush like whispered greetings, and the lavender along the path dipped gently as she passed. When she reached the edge of the grove, the gate was open. She hadn't left it that way. A small thrill moved through her chest, not fear, but anticipation. The kind that makes your breath draw in a little more sharply, your footsteps slow. Inside the garden, the light was gold and dappled, the same as before. But something had changed. The brass bowl on the pedestal's empty now, its surface polished, as if someone had wiped it clean. And on the sundial, someone had left petals. Not just one or two, but a careful arc of fresh blooms, cornflower, hyacinth, sweet alyssum laid in a quiet semicircle, as though marking time itself. Elodie knelt slowly and reached toward the sundial. Tucked just beneath one of the stones was a folded piece of parchment. She lifted it and opened it gently. In faint ink were the words, to mark the moment when sorrow softens into memory. There was no name, no sender, but the handwriting was familiar now. The same hand that had written the slips in the box beneath the pedestal. The garden's caretaker, unseen, or perhaps long gone, but present still. Elodie placed her pouch of jasmine in the brass bowl and stood in silence. The air was warm, filled with scent. The kind of scent that rises from earth and sun-warmed leaves, from blossoms that hold their breath before releasing it. She walked slowly through the garden, past the broken trellis, past the weeping cherry tree with its bark cracked like old hands. She knelt at one of the empty flower beds, its soil soft and dark, untouched by tools. From her satchel, she removed a small paper envelope seeds she had gathered seasons ago, saved without reason, now finding their place. She pressed each into the soil with care, covering them lightly, and whispered, "For what comes after silence." Her voice barely reached the leaves. Then, sitting on the bench beneath the old vine-covered arch, she pulled out her notebook and began to sketch. Not in fine detail, but shapes and light. The way the petals formed patterns on stone, the curve of the gate, the lean of the sundial's shadow. She wrote down the flowers she had seen, the ones left by other hands. She wrote the message from the parchment, and at the bottom of the page she added, "This garden is no longer forgotten. It remembers everything we cannot say." A breeze passed through, soft as breath. A petal drifted down and landed on her knee. She stayed until the sun tilted west and the air cooled again. Then she stood, bowed her head slightly to the garden as if leaving an old friend, and walked slowly back through the grove. By the time she reached her shop, the first stars had begun to show in the pale evening sky. The lantern above her door flickered to life, golden and quiet. Inside, she placed her notebook beside the ledger and lit a small candle. She didn't need to write in the ledger tonight. The garden had written its own entry. Instead, she sat by the window with her tea, watching the moon rise over Bellmare's rooftops. Somewhere beyond them, the petals beneath the sundial still rested in their perfect arc, and the garden continued to wait, as it always had, for stories to return. The week passed with a soft hush across Bellmare, as if the village had decided to whisper for a while. The tides remained calm, the air cool and fragrant. In her flower shop, Elodie worked quietly, arranging blooms that seemed to reach toward her hands without resistance. It was near the middle of the week when she noticed something strange. Each evening, just before the sun slipped fully beneath the sea, a sound would rise across the rooftops. Not the bells from the harbor, which chimed every quarter hour with perfect clarity, but something softer, lighter, like a bell made not of metal but of glass, touched by wind and memory. She first heard it while watering the hanging ivy by the front door. The sound drifted from the direction of the hills, faint but clear, just 3 soft notes, then silence. Then the wind, as if carrying an afterthought. She paused, listening, her watering can held loosely in one hand. The next evening, she heard it again, 3 notes, always the same. That night, she opened her grandmother's old journal, the one kept wrapped in cloth beside her bed. It had been years since she'd read from it, the pages worn and delicate, filled with pressed herbs and old phrases from when the shop was young. And there, near the middle, she found a page marked by a feather. When the garden rings, remember, someone has stepped into memory. Elodie sat very still. The garden. The bells weren't just sounds. They were signals. A way to mark an arrival or perhaps a return. Someone had entered the space or been called to it. The next morning, she prepared an arrangement with trembling hands. Not from fear, but from urgency. Bluebells, night phlox, and a single strand of trailing rosemary. She packed her satchel and left the shop at dawn. The path was still damp with morning mist. Birdsong threaded through the trees, and the air smelled faintly of salt and thyme. As she passed the grove and reached the gate, she paused. The garden looked unchanged, but as she stepped inside, she saw them fresh footprints in the soft soil near the pedestal. And something else. On the stone bench beneath the twisted arch, where she often sat, rested a folded shawl, pale blue, woven from fine threads. It shimmered faintly as if it had captured moonlight during the night and was reluctant to let it go. Elodie approached slowly. On the shawl lay a single piece of parchment. To the one who remembers what others forget. There was no signature. She picked up the shawl and held it against her chest. The scent on it was familiar but distant, like a song from childhood. She closed her eyes and breathed in slowly. Then she turned her gaze to the pedestal. The brass bowl was no longer empty. Inside it, resting gently among a ring of jasmine petals, was a small bell. It was made of glass, its shape delicate, nearly translucent, with a tiny silver clapper suspended within. Elodie lifted it carefully. It chimed faintly with her movement, a sound like falling snow or laughter behind a closed door. It rang just once, and the wind in the garden shifted. She stood there for a long while, holding the bell, the shawl still wrapped loosely in her arms. Then, almost without thinking, she rang the bell again softly, reverently. The garden seemed to sigh. She placed the bell back into the brass bowl, folded the shawl, and returned it to the bench. There were no instructions, no rules, only this unfolding quiet. Back at the shop, she wrote into the ledger again, for the one who returns by memory, bluebells, rosemary, and a bell that does not forget. And beneath it, if the garden calls you, follow. That night, as she drifted to sleep, the 3 soft notes rang once more in the wind. But this time she smiled, because she knew the garden was not just listening. It was welcoming someone home. The fog arrived before dawn, as it often did in Bellmare. But this morning it lingered longer than usual, curling through alleyways, hanging low above the rooftops and resting like breath on the window panes. The village was muffled, wrapped in softness. Elodie woke early, as she always did, but something tugged gently at her thoughts, a quiet insistence, the kind that arrives before language, before reason. She stepped out onto her front step and stood very still, the chill brushing her arms. The fog curled over the garden walls and swirled across the cobblestones. For a moment, she felt like she was the only person awake in all of Bellmare. Then she saw the footprints. Not deep, not hurried. Just a faint path of damp impressions leading from the square to the direction of her shop. They stopped at her door. A moment of pause. And then they turned, heading slowly toward the grove. She didn't hesitate. Inside, she packed a simple arrangement: violets, white heather, and 1 small branch of sweet olive. She added a sealed letter, not one she had written, but one left unopened for years, tucked inside the folds of her grandmother's journal. The envelope was fragile now, its ink faded, but it had always felt like it was waiting. She followed the footprints. The grove was hushed, no birdsong, no wind, just the thick silver fog and the rhythmic sound of her steps on the leaf-littered path. As she neared the hidden garden, she saw it before she stepped through the gate. A figure, not tall, not unfamiliar, wrapped in a dark coat, back turned, standing at the pedestal. Still, Elodie stopped. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The figure turned slowly. The fog blurred the edges of his face, but she saw enough. The shape of the eyes, the way the shoulders hunched slightly. He looked like someone she might have seen in a dream or a memory that had faded around the edges. He nodded once, then turned his gaze to the garden around them. "Do you remember it?" she asked, her voice barely more than breath. The figure took a long moment, then replied, "I remember the jasmine." That was enough. She stepped beside him and placed the bouquet into the brass bowl. Then, without speaking, she handed him the unopened letter. He didn't look surprised. He accepted it with hands that trembled faintly. He sat on the stone bench, opened the letter, and read. The fog began to lift, just slightly. A faint beam of sunlight pierced the edge of the grove, touching the sundial with a soft golden thread. He folded the letter gently and placed it beside the bowl. "I thought this place was gone," he said quietly. "I thought I had only dreamed it." "We all did," Elodie answered, "until it called us back." He looked at her then, truly looked. And though they had no names for one another, no words for what they had once known or lost, there was recognition, the kind that lives beneath spoken things. Together, they walked through the garden. She showed him the tree where the wind always curled twice before leaving. He showed her the place near the arch where he once buried a marble, long ago, when he had been a boy in a red scarf and muddy boots. They said very little, but the silence was not empty. It was full of return. When they reached the gate again, the fog was thinning fast. The village beyond shimmered into clarity. He turned to her and said, "This place ... it held me." She nodded. "It holds all of us." He didn't say goodbye. He simply stepped into the morning light and was gone. Elodie lingered in the garden a while longer. She rang the glass bell once gently. Then she opened her notebook and wrote beneath the day's page, "A garden remembers what even time cannot hold." Today someone returned. Rain arrived like a sigh over Bellmare. It wasn't a storm. It didn't lash or threaten. Instead, it tiptoed through the village, threading its way between window panes, brushing the cobblestones with a soft silver sheen. In Elodie's flower shop, the candlelight grew gentler as the skies darkened. The tiny flames in her wall sconces flickered not in fear, but as if dancing with the rhythm of falling water. She moved slowly through the back room, slippers whispering across the old wooden floor. The scent of crushed rosemary and beeswax drifted in the air. She had finished her daily arrangements long ago, yet she remained restless. Something tugged at her not urgently, but insistently, like a half-remembered tune begging to be hummed once more. Her hands wandered to the cupboard beneath the desk. It was small, built into the wall, with a door that creaked slightly when opened. There, wrapped in linen, sat the wooden box. She hadn't touched it in years, her grandmother's keepsake. The carvings on its lid were faded, smoothed from generations of fingers with wisteria vines curling around a flock of tiny birds. She placed it on the table and opened the lid. Inside, nestled in tissue as delicate as old lace, were pressed petals. Dozens of them, layered with the precision of memory. Each one bore a tiny hand-cut label, looped delicately with thread. Elodie reached in and lifted the top layer. July 3rd, bellflower. For the child who never spoke, her breath caught. She reached again. November 11th, snapdragon. The visitor with salt in his hair, then another. March 9th, wild rose. A memory left at the threshold. The petals were brittle but intact, like pressed stories. Their colors had softened with time. Lavenders faded to gray, crimsons dulled to dusty rust, but their presence was vivid. She imagined her grandmother, seated by this very desk, archiving these moments with slow, reverent fingers. The next petal she lifted was nearly black, velvet dark, its edges curled inward. There was no label. Elodie studied it in the candlelight, turning it gently, a flower kept in silence. Perhaps it was too painful to name, or perhaps her grandmother had known that some memories bloom best without explanation. She laid it gently on a cloth napkin and turned to her own notebook, where sketches and scrawled observations filled page after page. Beside it rested the small pressed bouquet she'd collected from the garden that morning: violets, white heather, and a sprig of sweet olive. She opened her linen pressing book, carefully placed the flowers inside, and folded the cover closed. As she did, she whispered, "For the one who returned, for the bell that never broke." Her pencil moved across the tags she cut from fresh paper. Today, the fog parted. The visitor sat beneath the arch. The garden held its breath. She tied it with thread and placed it into the wooden box, nestling it among the older petals. Her grandmother's archive had never truly ended. Elodie had simply taken her time finding her place within it. That evening, as the shop settled into stillness and the distant bells from the harbor sang low across the water, she lit a second candle and opened the window in her attic room. Rain-soaked air drifted in, cool and laced with the perfume of wet stone and ivy. She sipped tea from a porcelain cup, lemon balm and clover blossom, and listened. The wind rustled. A gull cried far away, and then, faint but unmistakable, came 3 chimes, not from the harbor, not from the shop, but from the direction of the grove. She leaned closer to the window. The notes were higher than the garden's glass bell. They shimmered like wind chimes touched by unseen hands. Their cadence felt less like a signal and more like an invitation. She whispered into the darkness, "You're still remembering." The petals, the notes, the voices returning one by one. The garden had become more than a place. It was a keeper, a silent archivist of the heart. She returned to her desk one final time that night and wrote in the shop, "Leather-bound ledger. The archive of petals has opened. One day someone else will find these pages, and they will know we loved quietly but completely." Then, with hands warmed by candlelight, Elodie closed the box. She placed it back into the cupboard with care, not to hide it, but to let it rest. Her part was not yet over, but the stories were safe, and the rain kept falling. The next morning arrived with a brightness that surprised the village. After days of fog and mist, the sun returned like an old friend, slipping in quietly through the kitchen door. Bellmare's rooftops glistened with the dew, and the harbor sparkled like a net woven from stars that had forgotten to fall. Elodie opened the shop early. The sun filtered through the front window, casting soft gold light across her counter and shelves. She moved in silence, watering ivy, checking the warmth of the teapot, trimming the edges of a bouquet left unfinished from the night before. Her fingers, though gentle, moved with purpose. In the sunlight, she saw the petals more clearly than ever. Windflowers, pure white, pale blue, blushed with soft pinks at the edges. She hadn't ordered them. She was certain of that. Yet they stood in a bucket near the door, dewy and fresh, as if freshly gathered from a field she hadn't visited. The bucket was the same one she used for deliveries, but she hadn't used it all week. She knelt slowly and picked up a single bloom. It was cool in her fingers, and the scent was subtle like new linen and faraway hills. She carried it to the back room and laid it across the pressing cloth without a word. On the stem, just beneath the bloom, she noticed something strange: thread. Wrapped around the stem was a delicate strand of blue-gray silk thread. It had frayed slightly at the edges, the color faded, but it was unmistakably purposeful. She knew then. Someone had left them for her, not a stranger. Someone who understood the language of flowers. someone who had once learned from the same woman who taught Elodie to press petals and tie messages with ribbons. She returned to the bucket and checked each stem. One by one, hidden in different spots, every flower held a thread. Some blue, some gold. One wrapped with green twine so fine she almost missed it. She placed a small sign on the shop's door, closed for the morning, and packed her satchel. This time she brought no offering, only the windflowers. She walked through Bellmare as the village stirred gently into life. A baker opened his shutters. A child played with a stick in the puddle near the post. From one window, a voice hummed an old sea melody. The grove awaited her. By the time she reached the garden, the shadows had shifted. The sun dappled the earth through the leaves, and the air felt lighter, more awake. The gate was ajar. Inside, everything was still, but not in the way of forgetting, in the way of waiting. She crossed the garden to the pedestal where the brass bowl rested, empty but polished. She gently placed the windflowers there, arranging them not by color but by thread. She didn't know what the pattern meant, but she followed instinct. Beside the bowl, tucked against the base, was a folded paper. She knelt and opened it. In careful, handwritten ink, she taught us to listen to what wasn't spoken. Now we listen again through you. No name, but she knew. A student of her grandmother's, a florist perhaps, or simply someone who had once been loved by the garden and never quite left it behind. Elodie sat on the old stone bench and closed her eyes. The wind moved gently through the grove, brushing across her face. A bird called softly from above, and then faintly the bell rang once. The note was clearer. One sound, one promise. She would keep it. That afternoon, back in the shop, she wrote into the garden ledger. The windflowers returned. The threads are still unbroken. And beneath it, we carry the memory of those who never said goodbye. As the sun began to lower toward the edge of the sea, Elodie lit a single candle in the window, no longer for mourning, but for remembering. And when the wind blew in through the open door, it carried with it the scent of windflowers and silk. That evening, with the sun melting into the sea, Elodie sat by the window in her upstairs room, a cup of warm chamomile resting in her hands. The golden light had turned the walls a buttery shade of comfort. Outside, the village glowed like a lantern, every rooftop edged in firelight. She had not opened the lavender drawer in years. It sat beneath the old writing desk, its handle carved like a rosebud, smoothed by time. Inside, her grandmother used to keep correspondence letters folded with care, bound in twine, sometimes tucked with herbs or dried flowers to hold a scent. Elodie had once peeked inside as a child, only to be gently shooed away with a smile and a whisper, "Not yet, little leaf. Let the letters rest." Tonight she felt ready. She knelt on the rug, gently pulled the drawer open, and breathed in lavender indeed, but also cedar, faded paper, memory itself. Inside were dozens of letters, many addressed to her grandmother in fine looping script, some clearly never posted. Others bore no names, only dates, or a single word. Hope, spring, first snow, return. Elodie selected one at random. The handwriting was unfamiliar, sharp, but graceful. To the one who understood silence. The garden sang once, on a morning when I thought I had lost my voice forever. You reminded me that flowers listen, and so I listened too. I have not forgotten the way you taught me to speak with petals. I hope you've taught another. She pressed the paper to her chest for a moment before folding it back into its place. Another letter, this time with a date, August 16th. Inside, a single pressed poppy. I left something in the garden that morning. Not just flowers, not just tears. I left the version of myself that couldn't hope. Thank you for keeping it safe. Tears welled in her eyes, not of sorrow, but of gentle ache. The kind that comes from recognizing that beauty and loss often dance hand in hand. She opened more letters, reading each one slowly, absorbing the rhythm of their gratitude, their longing, their quiet reverence for the woman who had once tended the garden as Elodie now did. And then she found one with her name. The envelope was small, cream-colored, tied with a faded blue ribbon. She stared at it for a long time before untying the bow. Inside, Elodie, if you are reading this, then the garden has called you home. Do not fear its quiet, nor the way it speaks in wind and memory. You were always meant to understand it. You are of the same silence I was, the same bloom. When you are uncertain, press petals. When you are lonely, water the soil. When the bell rings, listen. And when someone leaves a flower with thread, know they have not forgotten. You are not alone. With love always, grandmother. She read it 3 times. Her heartbeat softened each one. Then slowly, with hands that trembled and steadied all at once, she placed the letter back in the drawer, tied the ribbon, and whispered, I hear you. That night, long after the stars had taken their place in the velvet sky, Elodie sat at her writing desk, a fresh sheet of parchment before her. She dipped her pen and began, to the next who finds this drawer, the petals are still listening. So am I. She pressed a windflower into the fold and placed it inside the lavender drawer among the rest. And downstairs, in the shadows of the shop, the pressed bouquet from the garden's pedestal began to scent the room with something faint, like the beginning of a song. The next morning came with a hush. A light mist clung to the rooftops, but it wasn't the heavy fog of past days. This was thinner, more delicate, like a veil laid gently over the waking village. Bellmare yawned in soft grays and blues, as if the whole town had slept deeply and was not yet ready to rise. Elodie stepped outside with a basket in hand. She wore her long wool shawl, its edges stitched with threads of ivy green and thistle purple. Her boots clicked softly on the stones as she made her way to the rear garden behind the shop. The earth smelled like books left out in the rain, petrichor and paper, moss and something almost familiar. She gathered the herbs for sage, rosemary, and a few early violets that had decided to bloom despite the chill. As she leaned to snip a lavender stalk, she noticed something odd beneath the leaves, a folded paper, slightly damp at the corners, though the ink was not smeared. She picked it up carefully, eyes scanning the simple handwriting. The garden remembers you. No signature, no date, just that one sentence. Her breath caught lightly in her throat. She turned the paper over, nothing on the back. She held it in her palm for a moment, absorbing the weight of it, even if it weighed almost nothing at all. Later, back in the shop, she set the note on the counter and made tea. The same blend her grandmother used to make when letters arrived without names, lemon balm, chamomile, and 2 cloves floated in the pot. As the steam rose, she sat beside the small hearth and let her thoughts drift. She thought of the windflowers, the silk threads, the bell that had rung so quietly days ago. And now this message, left not in the public grove, not beside the pedestal, but nestled in her own garden. Whoever had written it knew where she lived. She did not feel afraid, only seen. Later that afternoon, a regular customer entered the shop, a man with silver-rimmed spectacles and a fondness for rare violets. He always wore a scarf, even in the warmer months, and spoke in a whisper as if afraid to interrupt the flowers. Today he lingered longer than usual. As Elodie wrapped his bouquet in soft brown paper, he spoke softly. The windflower is rare here. Only grows on the East Hill, past the orchard road. She paused in mid-fold. I didn't know. He smiled. Not many do. It grows where the ground is soft with memory. After he left, she stood very still behind the counter, the bell above the door still swinging faintly behind him. Soft with memory, she locked the shop early and walked the orchard road. Past the fruit trees, their branches still bare, past the wooden fence that leaned like it was listening. She followed the worn trail until the land dipped into a hollow and rose again toward the east. There, beneath a cluster of ash trees, were windflowers, dozens of them, blushing in pink and white, peeking through the grass as if waiting to be noticed. She knelt and touched the petals, soft, damp with dew. Some still curled closed, some open to the cloudy sky. She traced a circle with her finger in the earth beside them. Then, nestled under a stone, she found another folded paper. This one bore her name, just Elodie, written in a familiar ink. The same ink as the lavender drawer letters. Her grandmother's handwriting, but the letter was dated this year. She opened it slowly. If you've come here, then you've heard them. The ones who remember. The garden is only one part of Bellmare's memory. The hill is another. Listen, well, little leaf. The flowers here grow from promises. There is more. A map, hand-drawn. A circle around a place labeled only the vault. She pressed the letter close to her chest. The air smelled of earth, parchment, and violets. And she knew the story was unfolding just as it was meant to. That night, she tucked the letter inside her pillowcase, not to hide it, but to sleep beside it. Even in her dreams, she could hear the wind whispering through windflower petals, calling her onward. The next morning brought with it a subtle shift in the wind. It was warmer, almost spring-like, carrying the earthy promise of new blossoms. The scent of turned soil and wood smoke wove together like an old lullaby sung from the trees. Elodie stood at the threshold of her shop, a canvas satchel slung over her shoulder. In it, she had tucked her grandmother's letter, a fresh journal, a wrapped parcel of wildflower bread, and her smallest garden knife. She didn't know what she would find at the vault, only that the name stirred something inside her that felt older than memory. The hand-drawn map was simple. A line from the orchard hill curved eastward, past a small stand of birch trees, then bent toward the cliffs. Near the edge of the sketch, nestled behind inked vines, was a symbol, a circle within a circle. She passed through the sleeping orchard again. A robin chirped quietly from one of the branches, and the ground beneath her boots was soft, yielding in places from last night's dew. The hill of windflowers greeted her like old friends. She followed the curve of the land until she reached a stone wall, nearly swallowed by creeping ivy. The vines hung thick and draped like velvet curtains, and behind them she found it a door, or rather, the suggestion of one. Rough-hewn and moss-covered, set deep into the hillside. There was no knob, only a carved indentation the shape of a hand. At the base, a ring of symbols had been etched, faded but visible when the light hit just right. She hesitated only for a breath, then reached forward and pressed her palm to the stone. Nothing happened at first. Then, slowly, a tremor passed beneath her feet. A hush fell over the forest around her. The birds quieted, even the wind stilled. The door opened. Not wide, just enough. She stepped inside. The passage sloped downward, lit by the dim glow of lichen on the walls. It was not a tunnel of darkness. It felt more like entering a sanctuary. The scent of old cedar and dried herbs filled the air. At the bottom, the path opened into a room round, with a domed ceiling woven from intertwining roots. Candles, long burned low, sat in small alcoves. A table stood in the center, and on it, a single book bound in green leather. Elodie approached slowly. The cover bore no title, but as she opened it, she found pages filled with handwritten notes. Botanical sketches, flower recipes, pressed blooms between entries, and letters. So many letters. Her grandmother's handwriting, others two different styles, all carefully penned. This is the true archive, she whispered. Not the petals in the drawer, not the bowl in the grove. This vault, hidden beneath the vine, was where the deepest memories were kept. She turned pages gently, absorbing names and dates, and the soft illustrations of flowers now long vanished from Bellmare's fields. At the back of the book was a folded map. It showed not only the vault, but the locations of every secret garden her grandmother had planted, some in plain sight. Others tucked behind bakeries or down forgotten paths, or even beneath the sea cliff ruins. Each one marked with the same symbol, the circle within a circle. Elodie sat on the stone bench carved along the wall and felt the warmth of the earth wrap around her. She would visit them all. Each garden, each forgotten space, every echo her grandmother had left behind. She closed the book, placed it carefully into her satchel, and rose. As she turned to leave, her eyes caught one more thing. A dried wisteria bloom hanging by thread from the root-lace ceiling. It swayed gently, as if nodding to her. She reached out and touched it once. Then, with one last glance, she climbed the path back into the world above. When she emerged, the wind returned. Stronger now, but not harsh. It carried the scent of lavender and paper. The story was not ending. It was blooming. Elodie walked the village differently now. She still greeted the baker with a smile, still waved at the children weaving ribbon around the lampposts, still bought her salt from the woman with the striped apron, but everything held more weight, or perhaps more meaning. The green-bound book had not left her satchel since she found it in the vault. She read it every evening by candlelight, tracing each flower sketch with her fingertips, memorizing the hand-drawn maps as if they were lullabies. One garden had already called to her through dreams, a place behind the apothecary, long overgrown, once bordered with thyme and stone. The map had labeled it simply, First, so she went. The alley behind the apothecary was quiet. Most villagers walked past it without notice. The stone steps there had sunk slightly into the earth, and ivy curled thick around the banister. Elodie followed the path down, brushing away cobwebs and old leaves until she reached a rusted iron gate, painted once in a blue so soft it had nearly faded into gray. It groaned open with a sigh, and what she saw inside made her breath catch. The garden was still there. Frail, yes, neglected. The stone borders had cracked, and weeds threaded through what remained. But she could see the structure of it, like bones beneath the soil. A narrow path of river pebbles wound through the middle, where the remnants of old rose bushes tangled with chamomile. A wrought iron bench sat under a crooked fig tree, half covered in moss. The air was thick with the scent of mint and something softer clover or lemon verbena. She stood quietly for a moment, letting the hush settle over her, then stepped inside. As she walked the curve of the garden, she noticed signs of intention. A spiral of white stones near the fig tree, a rusted copper bell tucked beneath a patch of creeping thyme, a wind chime of pressed shells, cracked but still humming faintly when touched by the breeze. Elodie knelt near the central flower bed, where the weeds were thickest, and began to gently clear them. Her fingers moved slowly, brushing away moss, loosening roots, uncovering the shape of what had once been a circle of blooms. She found them too, roots still alive, if barely. Lily of the valley, rue, dusty miller, old-fashioned flowers that spoke in the quietest tones. She worked for hours, pruning, whispering to the plants, pressing her palms into the soil. It was not about restoring the garden all at once. It was about honoring it, listening to what it remembered. When she finally rose to stretch her back, she noticed something hidden under the bench. A wooden box. Its lid bore the faint symbol, a circle within a circle. Her heart fluttered. She opened it slowly. Inside, beneath layers of parchment, was a single pressed bloom perfectly preserved. It was ghostly white, delicate as breath, a snowdrop. Beside it lay a folded note. If this is found, then it has been long enough. I could not return, but I never forgot. This garden was where I learned what love could look like without needing to be named. Thank you, always. No name, but the ink was smudged at the corner, as if someone had held the page a long time before placing it in the box. Elodie rewrapped the note and gently closed the lid. She left the garden not with a sense of ending, but of opening. This was only the first. one of many threads her grandmother had woven quietly through the village, through time, waiting for someone to come and gather them again. As she climbed the stone steps back to the alley, the bell in the harbor rang once. The wind was gentle on her face. She smiled. Tomorrow, she would visit the garden behind the painter's cottage. But tonight, she would dream of snowdrops and soft earth and the way silence can bloom into something beautiful. The painter's cottage stood at the far edge of Bellmare, nestled where the cobbled road turned into packed dirt and the ocean could be heard more clearly than seen. Elodie had only visited once as a child, when her grandmother delivered dried hollyhocks for a still life. She remembered the place vividly chipped shutters the color of overripe plums, and a wooden stoop where paintbrushes rested in glass jars. She arrived just after dawn, the air tinged with salt and thyme. A soft fog curled around the roof like an old cat napping in the sun. The gate was unlatched. Vines tangled with honeysuckle framed the path. According to the map, the garden lay just beneath the wide window at the back, the one that once opened onto a wild sprawl of color and scent. Elodie rounded the side of the cottage and paused. There it was, a rectangle of stone-bordered soil, overgrown but not forgotten. Daffodil leaves poked through in yellow-green fans, and bluebells leaned as if listening to secrets in the earth. Beside the bed sat an easel, collapsed and folded, its frame wrapped in cloth now bleached by time. She knelt and brushed away layers of dry petals and curled leaves. There, nestled in the corner, she found a patch of pansies, small but alive, their purple faces turned upward. She smiled. Her grandmother had often said that pansies were the painters of the flower world, always wearing little masks of color. Tucked behind a loose stone, something glinted. She reached for it and found a brass locket, cool to the touch. When she opened it, there was no photo inside, only a tiny folded square of paper. On it, in faded ink, she painted flowers because they didn't mind being seen. I planted these so she would remember who helped them bloom. Elodie held the note gently in her palm. It told just enough, a whisper of a story that felt both personal and shared. Someone had tended this garden not for their own sake, but for the artist inside. And in return, perhaps the artist had painted them into permanence. She stood and turned toward the window. Though the curtains were drawn, the faint shape of an easel could still be seen inside. This place had once been vibrant. She could feel it in the ground, in the way the wind curled through the vines, in the echo of laughter that seemed to cling to the broken stepping stones. She pulled her journal from her satchel and sketched the garden, just as it was unruly, alive, quietly blooming again. Then she pressed a pansy between the pages and wrote, "The painter remembered through color, the gardener remembered through bloom. Between them, a garden still speaks." As she rose to leave, something fluttered from the vine above the window. A petal, just one. Pale yellow, shaped like a teardrop. She caught it before it touched the ground. There was no tree above, no flower in bloom quite that color. Only the painter's window, quiet and closed, and the memory of a garden that had once been tended by two hands, one with a brush, the other with a trowel. Elodie tucked the petal into her pocket and walked back to the village, her heart warm and full. She would return with seeds soon, she decided, perhaps sunflowers. Something bold, something that caught the light. But for now, she let the wind guide her footsteps. There were still gardens to find, and stories that waited beneath the roots. The bell rang 6 times as Elodie stepped onto the narrow path behind the old clock tower. The sound echoed gently down the alleys of Bellmare, as if marking not just time but memory itself. This tower had long been silent, its gears rusted and forgotten, its face moss-lined and cracked at the edges. But the map had marked something beneath it, a greenhouse. Tucked behind the structure, a hidden courtyard revealed itself between ivy-draped walls and climbing jasmine. The door was iron and glass, weathered and speckled with lichen. A small sign above read simply, Florarium. The lettering was almost gone. Elodie turned the handle. The door creaked open with a reluctant breath, and inside, the world changed. The air was warm, damp, and filled with green. Though the space had been abandoned, it was alive. Ferns reached from the corners, and orchids clung to rotted beams. Vines slithered through the cracks in the floor like old veins still carrying breath. Dust floated like glitter in shafts of morning light, and a faint drip of condensation tapped rhythmically from the glass roof above. In the center stood a long wooden table. Pots, cracked and empty, lined one side. The other held trays filled with soil, some freshly disturbed. She stepped closer and ran her fingers through the earth. Still warm. Someone had been here, and recently. She glanced toward a corner where a rusted watering can rested beside a wicker chair. Draped over the chair was a shawl. Not hers, not her grandmother's. Blue with yellow stitching, embroidered with a single flower. A bellflower. Her breath caught in her throat. She recognized the design. It had belonged to Morale, her grandmother's closest friend, long thought to have moved away before Elodie was born, but now it seemed she had never left. On the table, a new entry had been added to the green book, though Elodie had not written it. The handwriting was neat, elegant. The clock tower keeps more than time. This is where she taught me to listen for the second bloom. The first is for beauty, the second is for truth. Elodie sat in the chair, careful not to disturb the shawl. She opened her journal and added the passage beneath her latest drawing. Then, pressing her palm flat against the table, she closed her eyes and listened. Tick. The sound came from above, faint, deliberate. The clock, silent for years, had begun to beat again, not loud, not sharp, but present. A soft tick, followed by a pause, then again. She rose and looked upward. A rope ladder, frayed but intact, dangled near the back wall. She climbed. Each step creaked but held. The air grew cooler as she ascended, the scent of fern giving way to cedar and dust. At the top, she emerged into the clock's chamber, where great gears sat frozen in half-turns and cobwebs draped like curtains between brass spokes. And there, tucked beside a gear, was a folded napkin. Pressed inside was a flower. A night-blooming cereus, rare, fragrant only in the deepest part of the night. Its petals had browned at the edges but still held the faintest sweetness. The note attached read, "The truth opens only in darkness, but it glows when it does." Elodie folded the napkin gently and placed it in her satchel. She didn't know if Morale had left it that morning or 10 years ago, but someone had kept the greenhouse alive. Someone had known the rhythm of the second bloom. As she descended the ladder and stepped back into the warmth of the greenhouse, the clock ticked once more behind her. Outside, the bell rang. Once, the town didn't seem to notice, but Elodie did. She smiled, pulled the shawl gently around her shoulders, and whispered, "Thank you." Then she walked back through the misty courtyard, heart light, ears open. The scent of orchids and old time trailing softly in her wake. The Bellmaker's Arch was not marked on most maps. It stood quietly in the eastern quarter of Bellmare, where the streets narrowed and the air always smelled like warm stone and lemon balm. The arch itself was built from sandstone and shell, its keystone carved with an old emblem, a bell within a flower, or a flower shaped like a bell. No one could quite say. Elodie had passed beneath it many times, never knowing it led anywhere beyond the shadow it cast on the cobbled road, but the green-bound book said otherwise. Beneath it, it read, "Grew lavender that had never ceased to bloom, even through frost and storm." She came just after sunrise, when the arch's stone still held the night's coolness. She stood before it and traced the emblem with her fingertips, then stepped beneath. There was a path she hadn't noticed before. Thin, overgrown, but walkable. It led her into a pocket of garden so well hidden, it felt like a secret someone had almost forgotten to tell. Lavender, everywhere, growing in neat rows and wild bursts. Purple and pale blue, some silvery, some dark as dusk. Bees moved lazily between the blooms, and the air buzzed with the gentle hum of work without urgency. Elodie knelt and brushed her hands through the nearest stalks. The scent wrapped around her like a soft shawl her grandmother's perfume. Her childhood drawer of keepsakes, the herbal steam of winter baths. A low stone wall bordered the garden. Carved into it were names, small names, dozens of them. Each one tucked into a small heart carved above or below the lavender rose. She leaned in to read. Mila, Ewan, Lisette, Thomas, children's names. Some bore dates, some didn't. At the far end of the wall was a small alcove with a bell hanging beneath a wooden arch. Its rope was frayed but intact. The bell was small, no larger than a teacup, made of rose-hued copper. She gave it a gentle pull. The sound it made was soft, high, and strangely sweet. Not a chime, not a ring. A note like a lullaby hum, the kind that settles into your chest rather than your ears. Beside the bell, tucked in a nook of the stone, was another note, pressed flat with a tiny lavender blossom. These are the names of those who bloomed briefly. The bell rings so they are never lost. If you hear it in your dreams, it means they remember too. Elodie's eyes filled with warmth. Not tears, but the gentle ache of beauty that asks nothing in return. She sat by the wall and took out her journal. She didn't draw this time, she just listed names. All the ones she'd remembered from flower orders past, from quiet funerals, from births that became farewells too soon. She wrote them slowly, letting the garden hold each one. Then she planted a single lavender sprig near the smallest heart in the wall. The wind curled around her. The bell rang once more, and far above the arch, hidden from view, a second bell answered, fainter, higher, as if someone else had remembered too. She stayed until the sun passed overhead, the bees growing drowsy, the scent growing deeper. Before leaving, she pressed one of the older sprigs into her journal and whispered the names one last time. The path out seemed shorter, and when she passed beneath the arch again, she paused, turned, and whispered, "Thank you for still blooming." The stone warmed under her hand, and though no bell rang this time, she carried the hum of it in her chest all the way home. The cliffs that framed Bellmare's western edge had always held a kind of hush, a silence older than memory. The path leading there twisted between time-covered hills and tall beach grass that swayed in the morning breeze. As Elodie stepped onto it, the world behind her faded into softness, just distant bells and seabirds echoing faintly through the salt-thick air. She followed the trail with care, guided by the green-bound book cradled in her arms. The last garden her grandmother had marked was here. No intricate map this time, only a hand-drawn rose and a single word, edge. The path narrowed until it became nothing more than a foot-worn ribbon of soil. One side flanked by sloping meadow, the other giving way to vast sea and sky. The wind rose gently as she neared the highest point, tousling her shawl and brushing her cheeks with cool fingers. Then she saw them, roses, not planted in neat rows or trellised with care, but wild and free, stretching in a crescent arc along the very edge of the cliff. Their colors varied softest blush, cream, pale yellow, with hints of coral. Their petals trembled in the breeze but held firm, blooming with quiet defiance from rock and scrub. Elodie slowed her steps, then knelt beside one of the bushes. The petals were wind-kissed and slightly curled, but still vivid. Its stem twisted through a crack in the stone, rooted deeply, tenaciously, as if it had always been meant to grow here. Near its base, partially hidden beneath grass, was a small wooden marker. She brushed the green away gently. The wood was weathered smooth, but still bore a carving, a heart. Inside it, the familiar symbol circle within a circle. It was her grandmother's sign, but this time it felt more tender, more intimate. She looked up and realized each bush had one. Dozens of markers, worn but present, all encircling the roses in quiet witness. No names, no dates, only the emblem. A message passed from one heart to another across years, across wind and sea. She sat down in the grass, letting the breeze press against her shoulders. The sun had begun to warm the horizon, casting the waves below in ribbons of gold and steel blue. Behind her, the bells of Bellmare rang softly. In front of her, the ocean sang. Reaching into her satchel, she pulled out the green book and turned to the very last page. It was blank. Only a single pressed rose petal was tucked into the binding, so faded it had nearly become part of the paper. Elodie understood now. This was the garden of things left unspoken, of love that had no name, of grief that was carried silently, but tended all the same. She traced the edge of the wooden marker, then added her own beside it. A small smooth stone, which she etched with the same symbol using the silver nib of her grandmother's pen. Beneath it, she wrote just 3 words, "Still blooming here." Then she planted a cutting from her grandmother's garden at the foot of the stone, a rose bred for softness and resilience, pale blue with the faintest blush. A rose she had once been told was a bridging flower, meant to carry one season's soul into the next. The sea wind caught her hair and tugged at her sleeve. Somewhere in the vastness, a bird cried out and dove toward the surf. Elodie watched its movement, feeling the same motion in her chest wings unfolding slowly, steadily. This was the last garden. But not the end. There would be more. Maybe not marked on a map, maybe not written in a book. But the gardens her grandmother had sown quiet spaces of remembrance, of beauty, of tenderness, would continue, because someone remembered, because someone was listening. She closed the green book and held it against her chest. And as she stood, she felt the earth firm beneath her feet, the sea vast and forgiving behind her, and the roses still blooming at her back. Bellmare had many secrets. Some were carved into stone. Others were stitched into petals. But a few, Elodie had learned, were written between the lines. The map her grandmother left had one more clue, not a location, but a name scribbled into the border in faint ink. Inkpot Garden, no coordinates, no path, just a whisper of a place that felt like it had been hidden on purpose. Elodie didn't search with her eyes this time, she listened. She walked the town's quieter lanes, let her footsteps guide her along cobbles and gravel, turning only where she felt a quiet pull. Past the spice shop with its drying peppers, past the apothecary where dried rue hung from the windows. She moved like a breeze, following warmth. Finally, she came upon a courtyard she had never noticed. It lay behind the old bookbinder's shop, where stories were sewn into leather and secrets pressed between pages. A tall iron gate marked the entrance. Vines covered it entirely, ivy, sweet pea, morning glory, all tangled together like threads in a tapestry. She reached for the latch, which responded with a sigh and gave way. Inside was silence, but not emptiness. It was a garden of shadow and script. Tall trees with ink-dark leaves offered a canopy of coolness. Beneath them, beds of flowers bloomed in the deepest hues, black tulips, midnight irises, velvety pansies, the color of spilled ink. Each flower looked like it had been dipped in words. At the garden center stood a stone pedestal. Upon it rested a fountain, but not of water, ink. Thick, shimmering black ink flowed in gentle streams down the grooves of a carved basin. Not a drop spilled beyond the stone, yet the sound it made was like the rustling of a turning page. Beside the fountain lay a book, unbound, just a stack of thick parchment, its edges curled by time and wind. Elodie approached, fingers trembling softly. On the first page was a familiar script. Every garden tells a story, but this one listens. Below the words, faint lines swirled and drifted not ink, but vines. She watched, breath caught, as one leaf gently unfurled in the page's corner as though growing. She sat cross-legged on the moss beside the pedestal and opened her satchel. From it, she took her journal, her grandmother's pen, and a single sprig of rosemary from the first garden she had visited. She pressed it gently between the pages and began to write not just what she saw, but what she felt. The quiet presence of her grandmother, the joy of bees and lavender, the secret held by the painter's easel, the shimmer of night-blooming cereus beside a forgotten clock. Each word formed slowly, deliberately, until her handwriting and her thoughts became indistinguishable. As she wrote, the fountain grew brighter, as though the ink itself carried light. She paused only once to look around and listen. She could hear the wind outside the courtyard, but she could also hear faint whispering words not in her own voice, not spoken aloud. Echoes of stories this garden had caught and kept. Maybe from others before her, maybe from those who had come after. The book's final page remained blank. She dipped her pen into the ink fountain and wrote, "This is the garden that remembers what can't be spoken." Then she placed the journal beside the others, leaving it open on the moss. The garden rustled gently in response. Before she left, she pressed one black pansy into her satchel and whispered her thanks. The gate closed behind her with a hush like closing a book. As she stepped back into the world beyond, the sun warmed her shoulders. Birds called from rooftops. The sea was near, and the air tasted like endings and beginnings. Bellmare had changed, or maybe she had. The next page was waiting, and this time she would write the garden herself. Elodie stood once more in the heart of her grandmother's flower shop. The door creaked softly behind her as she entered, letting in a breeze that stirred the dried herbs hanging from the rafters. The scent of chamomile and cedar wrapped gently around her. Outside, the bells of Bellmare chimed noon, their tones softened by distance, like lullabies drifting in through lace curtains. She carried the green-bound book in her arms, its spine now softened by travel, its pages full, its margins covered with sketches, pressed petals, and the soft handwriting of memory. What began as a map had become a story, a quiet journey of gardens hidden in corners of the world that others had passed by. Places not meant to be found, but to be remembered. She placed it gently on the counter beside the sunlit vase of lily and opened the final page. Blank. It waited. Elodie didn't reach for her pen, not yet. She moved slowly through the shop, letting her fingertips brush the surfaces her grandmother once touched, the worn wood of the cutting bench, the smooth handles of the flower shears, the little window above the sink where violets used to sit in ceramic pots painted with tiny stars. Everywhere she saw her, not in objects, but in feeling. Her presence was a hum soft, ever-present, like wind moving through leaves or water over stone. On the back wall hung the bell, small, iron, delicate. Her grandmother had rung it once at the end of each day, a signal not just of closing, but of thanks, for the blossoms, for the customers, for the quiet work of tending beauty. Elodie walked to it now and pulled the cord gently. The bell chimed, a single clear note. The sound bloomed through the shop like light, warm and round. And when the chime faded, she knew what to write. She returned to the counter and picked up her pen. In slow, looping strokes, she wrote, "To those who bloom in silence, to those who plant kindness where no one sees, to those who water stories with memory and light, the gardens remember you. And so do I." She closed the book, not with finality, but with reverence. Then she reached into the drawer beneath the counter and pulled out a fresh journal, its cover a soft forest green, just like the one she had carried all this time. She opened it to the first page and, in careful script, wrote Volume 2. With a smile, she turned the page. The next chapter had already begun.